God's providence guides an orphaned and beautiful queen and a man of great character for such a time as this. Join us for today's lesson. Good morning, folks. We're going to be in the book of Esther. Fully, we are in the return era. That is, we have left the captivity era. There are Jews that are beginning to go back to Israel, and I use the word legitimately Jew at this time because this is where, in this captivity era, the 70 years that they were in captivity, the Israelites were in captivity, primarily the Judeans, but there certainly were a lot of the 10 tribes up in Israel still in this country of Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Persia, you could call it Assyria, all those different evolutions that they've gone through in all these years. So, but it is the era of return. This is our 9th era. This just happens to be a way in which we are chronologically following the Bible. The Bible, for our purposes of study, the Bible has been broken down into 14 eras. And we are now in the 9th of those 14 eras, and it's called the return era. And Esther happens to be during this time of return. However, Esther and the characters, the protagonists, the main characters of this book of Esther do not return to Judah or to Israel, the country of Israel, but they are Jews. They are Jews for sure. So with that said, the name of the lesson happens to be King of the Darkest Night. That's what we have been assigned a name for each of our lessons that we are teaching this 52 weeks as we go through the Bible. But I want to call this lesson Deliverance from Extermination. Deliverance from extermination is what this really gets down to. If I could give you just 3 or 4 words, those would be the words. There is going to be an exterminator in the characters of this book of Esther, and he has great prejudice. But what else is new about the Jews and prejudice against them? The whole world tends to be against them. Not particularly Christian. Most Christians stand for the Jews and know that they are God's chosen people and they want to protect them. I want America to be that way, and America has proven to be that way so far. And I'm praying that they continue that way. If not, America's in more serious trouble than they already are. So there are 10 chapters in the book of Esther. And I have a responsibility. I've talked to some of my fellow teachers. They're only teaching 4 of those 10 chapters. However, I take the tact when I'm a teacher that I'm hoping that someone is joining us that's really never heard the story of Esther before. So I'm going to briefly move us as quickly as I can through the book of Esther. I will concentrate on a couple of chapters that are very, very pertinent to this lesson. There is a great lesson here with application, tremendous application for us. It is the 37th lesson for us, and we will be seeing that God is moving, God has a plan, and He's always working. Those are the 3 things that I think I could develop very easily with this lesson. Well, in any lesson, we need to know some background and need to know a few of the characters and what's going on, because we'll be moving into the Bible, and the Bible doesn't give you a lot of the things that we have learned historically. You see, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrian kings, and the governments of these kingdoms at that time wrote an awful lot of history down. They may have written it on walls. They may have written chronicles on tablets. They may have written on parchment. and they have collected that. Now that's slowly being destroyed by the enemies of that part of the country, because you realize that today we call that Iraq, we call part of it Jordan, we call part of it Syria, we call part of it Iran, most of it Iran, and so those countries are constantly at war, and we're losing that history that's written down. But there is a lot of good secular history that ties directly into the Bible. We're not moving away from God's word at all. It's just tying I like to say in a Texas vernacular, tying a bow around it, meaning you've completed the package when you get all that together. So with that said, remember that where we're taking place is on the eastern side of the Tigris River. There's the Tigris and Euphrates River, and that's called Mesopotamia, in between the rivers. And we are on the eastern side in a city called Susa. But there are so many kings have gone through this country, this empire, the Babylonian Empire, that they've all had their little palaces in different places, starting in Nineveh. Kala was another one. There's one in Susa, of course, and there's one. The big one was in Babylonia also, so Babylon, and so they all have these different palaces around. Well, our story is about a 10-year period. Esther is a period it happens in 10 years. So don't think when you open the book and read all 10 chapters that you're going to bang, 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 one thing right after another. There's a lot of time in here, 10 years time, just for the story of Esther. And so with that said, you now get a little bit better picture of what's going on. Remember, King Cyrus, who was the king of Babylonia and the king of Persia, and he was a great king, and he had God influenced him to release the Jews after 70 years, and not all of them came back. Not all of them came back. The theologians that I read, and I've read many over the last 3 or 4 months, they feel that there may be as many as 1.5 million to 2 million Jews over in Babylonia now. And initially, when Cyrus issues a decree to say you may go back to your promised land, you may go back and rebuild your temple, and that's a man by the name of Zerubbabel that did that under King Cyrus, and it all occurs, and they only 50,000 of them go back the first time. Then there's some more later on that go back when Nehemiah goes back and builds the walls and those sort of things. And the great prophets, great workers for God. I mean, many names that you would know. Bingo, they're there. I mean, they are working for God, reminding the Jews that who they are. They are to follow God. So this has all happened, but now we're coming to a point where we want to see what is this book of Esther about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, then we'll get into God's word about what's going on. First of all, there is a man that is the king, the current king, where we are today, where Esther will be today, in today's lesson, is a man named Xerxes. Xerxes is a Mede. His Greek name was Xerxes. All kings at that time were called by a title, and this title was, and this is the only time I'm going to say it, I will use the word Xerxes, even though the Bible may put this word in here for king, but it's sort of like Pharaoh over in Egypt. Everyone that was a king of Egypt was a Pharaoh. They also are a Hasuerus, Hasuerus. It's a title, and it means high father. And it is so they're all of these guys that were the kings through this Persian Empire, and before that the Medes, and before that the Babylonians, before that the Assyrians. They are all called Ahasuerus, and but his real name, his Greek name was called Xerxes. And he is a grandson of Cyrus, King Cyrus. Xerxes is a grandson of his. he will be there. There'll be a palace coup later on. He gets assassinated, but there will be a palace coup, and another king will come in called Artaxerxes at that time, and but he is the king at this present time. And just to give you a flavor of who he is, he is the son of Darius. He's the grandson of Cyrus, but he's the son of Darius. Now, Darius had been the king for many years and had been defeated. If you've heard of well, runners today run marathons, and you've heard of the great battle of Athens and the runner running from Marathon up to Athens to tell them that the Persians have been defeated. Darius was that guy that got defeated. Well, Xerxes is going to pull a little stunt on his own self, and he's going to get defeated too. Only this time it'll be a battle of ships in the sea. And but just a little bit of background about these kings. Most of them are assassinated from time to time. Well, Xerxes, he's trying to gather a coalition. He has 127 countries. He calls them provinces in the Bible. But he has 127 countries, all the way from Ethiopia over to, I can't think what the Bible defines. We'll read it in just a minute. I don't have it in my mind right now. But he describes, it's a fertile crescent, this half moon shaped, it's the fertile crescent. But they do not have what you and I call Greece today. That's Macedonia back then, and Achaia, places like that were they don't have the control of that, but Xerxes wants to have it. Darius wanted to have it, but they don't get it. And so he calls a coalition of all these different princes from around his 127 countries. They come to Susa, and they have a big party. The king Xerxes is living it up. And he is having a party with these guys. He's trying to get a coalition because he wants to go back over and try to whip the Grecians, whip the Macedonians, and the Achaeans. Athens is really down by Achaia, but it's all what you'd call Greece today. So he's calling this coalition, and he has a party of 180 days, half a year, and he has this feast, and he's trying to gain support from them to go to battle. And he does get the support, and he does go, and he gets his tail tucked between his legs and has to come home defeated again. Xerxes does. And that's kind of important, because you need to know that, because he comes back from that battle dejected. Well, his wife, then Xerxes calls a 8-day feast for the local politicians, just the local ones that are around Susa. He calls a party there, and this is a drunken party. This is a bad party. And he calls his wife, whose name is Vashti. He calls her and says, "Come, my wife," and I want the wife to come and show her beauty to all these men. Well, you can't imagine a woman would want to come in with a bunch of drunken guys. It wasn't forced on them. They didn't have to drink. The Bible says they didn't have to drink if they didn't want to, but they were drinking, and he called for his wife. Well, she didn't come, and that upsets the king Xerxes a lot, and he throws a hissy fit about it. He calls his Secretary of State and all his prime minister and all that, and says, "What do you think I ought to do?" And they said, "Well, you can't let the queen get by with this, king. You can't let her get by with this. So you're going to have to do something, because all of our wives will start rebelling on us if you don't lower the boom on her." So Xerxes says, "All right, I will depose her. She's no longer the queen." And she has Queen Vashti. I feel sorry for her. I can't help but feel that way. She gets divorced from the king. She refused to come to that 7-day feast that the king was having. And I would tell you, I think any wifely woman would not want to come into that sort of atmosphere anyway. So she happens to be one of the many daughters of Belshazzar. Belshazzar had been one of the Babylonian kings You'll remember him in the book of Daniel and the writing on the wall, the hand of the writing on the wall, and Belshazzar seeks interpretation, and Daniel gives him that interpretation. So she's very, I think she's a good woman, but she's just been caught in a trap. And Xerxes has low moral character. He's not the greatest guy, in my opinion. The Bible doesn't give you a lot of details on that, but I'm just drawing conclusions here. Well, so far we've studied Xerxes, we've studied Vashti, and now we're going to study the culprit of all, the really bad character, the one that has great prejudice in his heart. His name is Haman, and Haman is he's a minister working at the initial part of Esther. He's working for Xerxes, but he's not the prime minister. But he's worming and trying to connive, and his wife is pushing him. This is all in the Bible. This is all in Esther, in the book of Esther. And she's encouraging him, and so he wants to be the number one guy. He wants to wear the ring, and that's the king's ring. And not the king, but he wants to be prime minister, and he does attain that job of prime minister. But he's a scoundrel. He's full of prejudice. He plots against the Jews. He wants people when he's walking out in the city of Susa, he wants people to bow down to him. He wants to be the man, and the Bible tells us that. So he is quite a character. He is a descendant of Esau. And you know Esau and Jacob. You know the sons of Isaac and that story. And he is in a family that's a big enemy to Israel. So it's God's hand is in all this whole story. It is God's work, silently working, just moving and making things happen, as he does today. He's in charge of my life, and I'm just loving it, and that's the way it should be, and I hope it's that way for you too. So, well, he wants to get a decree. He eventually there's one more character. Well, there's two more characters we're going to talk about in just a minute. But he wants to get a decree against the Jews because one character, who is the highest character of all, who is a good man, his name is Mordecai. And Mordecai is a great guy. And he adopts an orphan girl by the name of Esther. And she comes under his wing, his tutorage. He is a Jew, a devout Jew. He proclaims he's a Jew. He walks down the streets, you know he's a Jew. The Bible says he's well respected around the circles of the Jews, and he's a nice guy. He's a government official. He's a lower official. He's not the head man by any means. He's not even a judge yet. I think Esther later on will get him a judgeship, but he's a government bureaucrat right now. And he won't bow down to Haman, and Haman is furious about that. And he plots, and there's going to be a story here that you're going to build in just a minute that has to do with the destruction, the extermination of the Jews. For a time such as this, God is setting a plan in place. And I'll show you how that plan works in just a second. But let me get through all of the characters here. Haman will bribe Xerxes. He goes to him with a plot and says, I can give you 300 tons of silver if you will allow me to exterminate. He doesn't even say who they are. The king could care less. King just shrugs his shoulders and says, okay, you do what you think is right. And he says, I'll give you 300 tons of silver. Well, that's 12 million ounces of silver. Now, silver was worth, I believe, more back then. It was more or less a barter system. There were coins beginning to be developed, but not many. And it was a barter system more. So I think silver was worth a lot of money back then, more than it is today. Today, it closed Friday at $18.18 an ounce, and Haman is telling his king, I'll give you 12 million ounces of silver at $18.18 an ounce, that's not too bad. That's not too shabby. Well, Xerxes' mind is moving and saying, okay, go do what you think is right. He doesn't ask anything. Doesn't ask, who are these people? Anything like that. He just said, you do it. We're going to exterminate. In one final day, in one day, boom, all over the empire, 127 provinces that they control. They even control Egypt, I might say. It used to be a powerful country. And we're gonna exterminate every Jew. Well, that doesn't set too well. The next character is Mordecai, and Mordecai is a quality man. I think he is an outstanding good man. I think the whole story should revolve around God's deliverance, God's providence. I opened this with my brief introduction, said, in God's providence for a time such as this. And that providence we'll get into in just a second. Allow me to close the gap on who Mordecai is. He is a Benjaminite. He's from the tribe of Judah, and he is distantly related to Saul. And don't think that he's the same man as Saul. Don't even put that in your mind. He's a different man. He's a man that is courageous, and he's also got great character. I like his character. He's going to stand his ground. And there's another lady that's going to come up next that she'll stand her ground too. But he has a lower job to begin with. He's a bureaucrat, but he will rise when Esther becomes the queen, which you don't even know the story about yet, but she will become the queen of the whole country of Persia, this mighty empire of 127 provinces. She will become the queen, and she gets him appointed to be a judge. And a judge, in those days, the judges were civil judges, not the criminal judges, but they would sit at the city gates. And Mordecai sits at the city gates, and here's something that'll be interesting to you in just a minute. So now we have our final character. Remember, Mordecai is the good guy. That's the one I want to concentrate on. And there's another one I want to concentrate on because she's super also. She's going to stand for the Lord. She's going to stand. The Lord's not mentioned here. In fact, it irks me that every theologian and every book that I read, and I read many of them in the last several months on this part of history, all the exile and starting with the Assyrians, the attacks in Judah and the attacks up in the northern 10 tribes and all that sort of thing. I've read many of them, but the one in Esther that irks me is it says, nowhere is God's name mentioned. That's true. That's very, very true. The word God does not come out. I mean, you won't find it in there. But I see it between the lines so big and so much that he's moving and making things happen. And I'm going to prove that to you, I hope, by the end of this lesson. So, well, we come now to a lady that is named Esther. And her Persian name is Esther. And that Persian name means star, S-T-A-R. But she has a Hebrew name. The Bible tells us in Esther that her name is Hadassah, H-A-D-A-S-S-A-H, Hadassah. And in Hebrew, that means myrtle. Well, we live here in Houston. Charles and I live here in Houston, and I hope there's someone tuning in doesn't even know anything about Houston. But if you drive around Houston very much, you're going to see an awful lot of myrtle trees in Houston, Texas. They grow very well. They're beautiful. They bud several times a year, either white buds, pink buds. So her other name in Hebrew was myrtle. We call them crepe myrtles here in Houston, Texas. But she is a Hebrew, but Mordecai, in God's providence told Mordecai, don't let Esther reveal that she is a Jew. Keep that to yourself, that she's a Jew. Well, usually the Jews would want to very much say who they are, and they are different. They're entirely different. They walk different. They dress different. That sort of thing. Their mannerisms are different. And normally you would have that. But in this case, Mordecai, through God, talking to Mordecai and saying, Mordecai, keep it quiet that she's a Jew. Now remember, I said that Mordecai admits he's a Jew. He's a devout Jew. And I don't know that there were a whole lot of devout Jews at this time. Remember, the Jews, the 50,000 that went back initially have gone back. They are now back in Judah, and they're repairing, they're rebuilding the temple. However, that doesn't happen just in the snap of fingers either. That's a long, long process for that to happen. So Mordecai has adopted Esther. She is an orphan child, and she's closely related to Mordecai. Mordecai's uncle, I think it was, that had a daughter, and the parents are dead, so he takes her as his own and grows her up. She's probably very, very young at this time, very, very young at this time when she will become queen. But he adopts her. She's a Jew in secret, and she is beautiful. Remember now that if I were to ask you what two books in the Bible are named after women, you have one that's Ruth and one that's Esther. And I like to mention these things because I want you to know God's word is so perfect and so much there. He never misses a beat. I mean, he can't miss a beat. He's perfect. And I tried to be perfect in the business world, and you can't do it. You cannot do it. It just doesn't work. But God is perfect. And here's where I want to nail one thing that says how perfect he is. He has two books, Ruth, and he has one called Esther. Well, Esther will marry a non-Jew. Esther marries a non-Jew, the king of Persia. His name is Xerxes. And in Ruth, you have a non-Jewish, she's not Jewish, Ruth is not, but she marries Boaz, and he is a Jew. So God's working with the Jews, and he's working with the Gentiles at the same time. I like that part of the story. So, well, we now have all the characters, and you know what's going on. We're going to get right into the lesson, but before we do that, I want to put one more nail to prove that God is in this, and that is that I want to talk to you about a word called providence. Providence is the protective care of God. I looked it up in the Webster's Dictionary. Go look it up. Protective care of God is the first definition it gives. It also has divine guidance, divine care and guidance is another one. And provide is in the word provident, Providence. And the first part of providence is provide. God is the provider. God will provide. Now, what am I talking about here? God had said, when the 70 years is up, when you have been in captivity for 70 years, I want you to know that I am God, and if you know that I am God, and if you will follow my way, you will go back and take your promised land again and recover your promised land. You will have it. And they will have it forever, my friends. They will have it. It's not going to go away. God said it. It's a done deal. And with that said, God is providing, and even though they have broken God's will, Esther, Mordecai, both Jews, Esther in secret, Mordecai in the openness, they are Jews. They have not gone back. But in God's providence, he has provided an avenue by which he knew what Haman is going to do. He knew what this lousy king Xerxes was going to do. Do nothing is what he was going to do. He was more worried about his wealth and his battles and all that sort of thing. So he, God in his providence, provided a way to keep the extermination from happening. Bingo. That's the one that I wanted to make sure you understand. So it is the hand of God. God directs all things, my friends. I've written this note to myself. God directs all things, good and evil, even the evil he directs. Yes, things happen to me. God has not said, do this to Jim deliberately, but it has happened, and he could change it if he wanted to, but most of the time he doesn't want to change it. Let old Ingram go ahead and make the mistakes of his life. Let him go ahead. It'll come out. We'll get him through the valley, and I hope that he survives. I pray that he survives, is what God is saying, really. God doesn't have to pray. It can happen the way he wants it to happen, but God directs all things, the good and the evil, towards worthy purpose. He's always on track. He's after a worthy purpose. His will prevails, always. His will prevails. Whether it's to punish me or to make me walk through the valley and then learn something from it, that's all right. That's the way it is. I don't want to deliberately get into those things. I'm trying to get the Spirit to talk to me, and Spirit with a capital S. God works all things after the counsel of his own will. Now, those are not my words. I read those from a theologian. I'm stealing his thunder here. God works all things after the counsel of his own will. His own will. God doesn't need a lot of counselors around him. You're going to find that Xerxes had to call in all of his secretaries of state and all of his foreign ministers and everything else to try to figure out what to do. God doesn't do that. God has his counsel is his own will. Our God runs the universe, my friends. He runs the universe. Well, let's get into God's lesson. Chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to go through quickly now and move on as we can. And where the word Hasuserus is, I'm always going to use the word Xerxes because it makes me stumble. Now, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Xerxes, this was the Xerxes who reigned over 127 provinces. That's where I get the 127 provinces. From India to Ethiopia, that was the word I couldn't remember. In those days when King Xerxes sat on the throne of his kingdom, such was in Susa, the citadel. There's a citadel there. But it's his winter palace, really, is what it gets down to. When it's cold up in the north end, he comes down to the south end. That was in the 3rd year of his reign. He made a feast for all his officials and servants. Remember, I said there was a 180-day feast? And he brought in all his powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes, the provinces before him. Then he showered the riches of his glorious king. He showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and splendor. Well, let me move on there and tell you that this feast lasts 180 days. He's trying to gain a coalition to be able to get his battle gear together, and he does. Now remember, this is over a 10-year period, so it doesn't happen overnight. And so he's trying to gain respect from all the princes. Send your soldiers with me when we go to battle. We're going to go over and try to whip Greece again, second time. And they do gain a little foothold in Athens, is what secular history tells us. But they get defeated on the sea, and they tuck their tail between their legs and go back home, and they don't try to mess with Greece any longer. And finally, Greece will defeat them. You do realize that Alexander the Great will come in and defeat them in about 330, probably 3 something like that. The year BC, we're probably up in 450 or 460 BC right now. And don't quote me on those numbers, but that's where we are, I think. So, well, now after he's had that 180-day feast, he's got the coalition together. He now calls for a 7th-day feast. I said 8 days. On the 8th day, something happens, but on the 7th, it's a 7-day feast, and he brings in all the local politicians, and he's going to talk to them. And this is a little more of a drunk party than the others, and he gets the bright idea to just show off. This is Xerxes, so I'll get my beautiful wife named Vashti and bring her over and let the boys see her. Well, that's against the law, number one. No one is to look on the queen. No one is to look on the queen. Well, but he's not thinking straight. So he goes on and says, send the queen over. The queen refuses to come. So he goes to his counselors. The king goes to his counselors and says, boys, what do I do? And they say, boss, you can't let this happen. The women can't get control of this deal. You're going to have to do something. So he says, okay, I'll fire her. I'll divorce her. And so he does divorce her. And this goes on in the next chapters, and we're moving on now as quickly as we can. And he will, at this time, he really goes off to war. And it's not in the Bible, but there's a gap here of a period of a couple of years, and secular history tells us that he does go and tries to whip Greece. He doesn't have a wife. He comes home. Now we're back in Esther. Now he comes home, and he does see that he doesn't have a wife, and he's lonely. So he says, what do I do, boys? And the boys say, well, you probably ought to have a contest, a beauty contest. You ought to just have a beauty contest. Call from all your provinces, get the pretty girls, bring them in, and clean them up, get them smelling of perfume. And in fact, the Bible tells you, if you read the book of Esther, and I hope you will, it says that they spend a year. Each of these beauty queens that comes in, they spend a year. Half a year they're in the perfume parlor, and the other half of the year they're learning how to use their different accoutrements, how to dress and all that sort of thing for the king. So the king marches them all in front of him. And finally, one comes forward. Mordecai is the one that did this. Again, God's providence. God provides. God provides is what I want you to understand. Mordecai says, for such a time as this might be the time that God has. I think this is what he was saying. The Bible doesn't say this, but I think that's what he was saying, that this is a good time for her to get closer to the king. It would be good. So he suggests to her that she enter the contest, and she wins the contest. In fact, Xerxes goes crazy for her. He says, finally he'll say, half my kingdom, whatever you want, just tell me what you want and you got it. And she becomes his queen. He marries her and he becomes married to her. So now he is she's the queen, and Mordecai is a bureaucrat, and she gets him to be a judge. And as a judge, they sat on the city gate, and they ruled on certain civil matters. Well, Mordecai, again, God's providence. Mordecai hears two eunuchs that work for a King Xerxes. Mordecai's not supposed to be hearing this. Not supposed to be hearing it, but God makes sure that Mordecai hears it. And that's why I say you can't tell me that God's not in this deal. He's all over it, my friends. He's all over it. So he then hears a plot by these two eunuchs. They're going to kill Xerxes. They're going to plot to kill him. So he goes to the queen. He's still got the ear of the queen. He's told her to be silent. Don't tell anyone you're a Jew. But she listens to him. That's her stepfather, really, and she respects him. He's a wise man, and he's got great character. So he goes to her and says, "Why don't you tell the king that there's two men that are going to kill him, and here are the names of the men that are going to kill him?" Well, the king checks all this out, and sure enough, it happens. It does happen, and he now. The king now respects Esther more. But you know what? The king didn't say, "Who told you this, Esther?" Mordecai doesn't get any credit for it. Mordecai's name is not mentioned in the whole deal. And so the king he just doesn't even ask. It's the same way when Haman comes to him about killing all the Jews. He doesn't ask, who are these people? What's going on here? He just says, okay, take care of it. And they're about to wipe out the whole Jewish race. I mean, they're about to just do it. That's what the devil would love to do. And he still wants to do it today. He can't get Jesus. He certainly can't get him. He tried. He can't do it. But he can sure get Christians. He can certainly get the Jews. And he's done a pretty good job of the Jews of trying to destroy them. Move forward to World War II and see what happened in World War II. But it's more than that. I mean, it's the Romans that destroyed them in 70 AD. And so with that said, let's now go as a public official. Mordecai was at the city gate where business matters were conducted. And he heard two of the king's officials plotting to kill him. He told his niece, Queen Esther, and the king sentenced the men to be hanged in the gallows. Verse 20 of chapter 2. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. This is in the Bible. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. She wants to follow him. She's the queen. She doesn't get to go in front. You understand that you can't go in front of the presence of, you can't just knock on the door and walk in to see the king. That doesn't happen. In fact, you're subject, it was against the law to do that. So you would be subject to being executed if you did that. That'll come up in just a few minutes. So it's not by accident that all of this happened, my friends. And remember that the king did not reward, he didn't even ask who Mordecai was. How did you get this information? He doesn't even know about Mordecai at this stage of the game. But in chapter 3, verse 8. Now, Haman has gone to the king in chapter 3, verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people of all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are all different from our people's laws. They do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it's not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, he's talking to the king now, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents. That's 300 tons. That's at 12 million ounces that I said was $18.18 an ounce. Today, I think it was worth more back then, of silver into the hands of those who do the work. In other words, they'll bring it back. We're going to kill the Jews. Haman doesn't have that kind of money, but the Jews do, and they're going to get that money when they wipe them all out and bring it into the king's treasuries. Verse 13 of chapter 3. And the letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Altar, and to plunder their possessions. That is, steal everything from them, take it back. That's how the king is going to get all that silver. And the king does that. The horses leave. The Bible tells us that these thoroughbred horses run all over the territory, the 227 provinces, and they take a lot. That's some type of a dice or a throwing of a lot, pulling something out of a hat or something that called pure, P-U-R. Purim is what we're going to get to in a minute. Don't worry about that word right now. It was pure, meaning lot. You draw lots, and that they picked the 13th day is what it gets down to do the killing. They're going to kill every one of them on that day. You say that'd be an impossible thing to do? Not when you're the king of millions and millions and millions of people, and they've got these soldiers that are standing over you with spears and swords and shields and mighty horses and battle gear and things like that. So the king doesn't even seem to care who these folks are. He wants to pay for this costly war that he's just had. So now in chapter 4. When this decree goes out, Mordecai hears of this decree and sees it. He reads it. Every Jew is going to be killed on this day. And he's he's taken back. Chapter 4 tells us that he puts ashes all over his hair and his face and his skin. He wears sackcloth. He's going up and down the streets crying and wailing and saying, this is wrong and this is wrong. And by the way, Haman sees all these things going on. So it gets back to Queen Esther. And she sends some eunuchs out to see him and says, what are you doing? Here's some pretty clothes. Put on the clothes. Clean yourself up, Mordecai. You're a judge. You're my father. You're my stepfather. Take care of yourself. Don't. And he says, wait a minute. Tell Esther what's going on. Here's the letter. Tell her that the king has decreed that all the Jews are going to die. And he says some very, very important things that are in the Bible. Never underestimate, this is me speaking, never underestimate that God is providentially working. His providence is always working. There are times when God moves in ways you don't recognize. I don't recognize. At first, especially if you're not following him closely. Boy, that's true. Esther had an inside track to the king. Unbeknownst to the king, the queen is a Jew. And he's said all Jews are to be killed. He loves her. He thinks she's the most beautiful thing in the world. I think he does love her. I think he does love her, if love can be in his heart. Mordecai reached out to Esther in a letter reminding her of the opportunity she had and the position she had been placed in. This passage contains one of the most known verses in the Bible, from not in the Bible particularly, but in the book of Esther for sure. And it's a businessman's term used many times. So let's read in chapter 4, verse 13. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, these eunuchs that have come out. Do you not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace and more than all the other Jews, any more than all the other Jews? You're going to get it too. You're going to have the problem too. And if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. In other words, my faith is so strong. Mordecai is saying, my faith is so strong, I know that something's going to happen. I think he's saying, God will make something happen. It doesn't say it in the Bible, but that's what I think he's saying. But you and your father's house will perish. Your father was a Jew, and I'm a Jew. Your father's house and my house are all going to perish. You have known, yet who knows whether you have come, now this is the important part, who knows whether you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this. God put her there for such a time as this. He's going to destroy the plans of man for evil. He is going to destroy the plans of that. Well, that was in verse 13. We then go to verse 16, and she's now cogitating, she's contemplating, she's thinking. And she says to the eunuchs who say to Mordecai, go gather the Jews. Get all the Jews together that are present in Susa, and fast ye for me. In other words, fast for me. Pray that I will, with fasting comes prayer. And I see in between the lines, pray for me that I will have the courage to do what I'm about to do. And neither eat nor drink for 3 days and 3 nights. Someone else did something for 3 days and 3 nights. You realize that. Jesus did. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go. Now this is her telling Mordecai. So will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law. I can't go to the king unless he calls me. I'm his wife, but I can't go before him. No one can go before him unless he holds. When you do, you better hope he holds out his scepter. That says in the Bible, if he holds out his scepter, you're in good shape. If he doesn't hold out his scepter, you've broken the law and you're subject to execution. According to the law, and if I perish, I perish. She says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. This is not right. I'm going to do it. Boy, do I like that. Well, then verse 17 of chapter 4 says, Mordecai went his own way and did according to all that Esther had commanded. He calls the Jews for a fasting. In chapter 5, she does go before the king, and he holds out his scepter and says, good to see you. What do you want? This is in chapter 5. What do you want? What can I do for you? Half of my kingdom is yours. Just name it. Whatever you want, it's yours. I like you. I love you. So Esther says, I'm going to have a banquet, king, and I'd like for two of you, you and Haman, to come. You and Haman come to this banquet. And she knows who the culprit is here. She knows who Haman is. And so she says, King, tomorrow night, you and Haman come and I'm going to have a feast with you. And I'll tell you then what I want, what I need you to do for me. And the king held out his scepter, and Haman and the king the next night come, and he says, okay, queen, what do you want? And she says, I want you to know that there is a man that has done evil to my people. She's saying to the king, to my people. He says, who are your people? The Jews. She says, you've put out a command to kill all the Jews, and I'm part of the Jews. And my stepfather is part of the Jews. And he says, who in the world did this? Who is this guy? It's Haman, she says. It's Haman. Well, Haman pays his price. Haman has already built a hanging. He has built a gallows in Susa, 75 feet tall. And he wants to hang at the insistence of his wife. She's pushing him. Haman's wife is pushing him. She says, hang him high. And so he's going to be hung on a 75-foot gallows. Mordecai is. But now all of a sudden, one of the eunuchs steps forward and says, an advisor to the king, and says, the king says, well, what do you mean Haman did this? And they find out that Haman did it. And one of his eunuchs says, there's a gallows out there right outside your palace where they were going to hang Mordecai. Why don't you hang Haman there? So the king says, do it. So they hang him. He's dead. He's gone. And his 10 sons will get killed later, and then they come back and hang the 10 sons later on. So after they're already dead, by the way. So it goes on and on and on. But it all happens. And in chapter 6, now that we go back to the king, can't sleep. Something's bothering him. And it's in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And it's very important. That night, the king could not sleep. He's asleep in his bed, and he couldn't sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles. This is just like the House of Representatives and the Senate writes all their minutes down and things like that. Well, this is not the book of Chronicles of the Bible. This is the history of the Persian Empire. And it's written down in there, and he says, bring the book of the records. I'm just sleepless, and I don't know what it is. Again, God's working on him. God's working on even Xerxes. He's working on him. And they were read before the king. In other words, the king says, read them to me. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bighatha and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay their hands on the king, Xerxes. Then the king said, what honor of dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Remember, nothing had been done. They didn't even know the name Mordecai until now. And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who's in the court right now? Who's here? I want something done. He's been sleeping And you know who happens to be there? Man, does God have this thing worked out. Walking right through the court is Haman. I mean, bingo, he's there. And he is not hanged yet. He's not dead yet in this part of the story. But he is there. And now Haman would just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that they hang Mordecai on this gallows, and that he had prepared for him. Well, the king brings him in, brings Haman in, and he says, I want to give a great honor to a man that I respect and a man that's good. Haman puffs out his chest and says, I think it's me. I think you're going to do it for me, aren't you? So put him on your horse, king, and put him on the finest clothes and let him march right through Susa. Let him go right through Susa. Let the people say, what a great man. Haman's hoping for that. But the king says, all right, that's a good idea. Go get it done. Go find Mordecai and put him on the horse and take him, you Haman, take him right through the city. Can you believe this story? This is unbelievable. Well, let's continue on God's story. Now a complication has come up. Haman is dead. Mordecai has been vindicated and is in good shape. The king is remorseful that he has decreed that all the Jews will be killed on a certain date. And when the king puts his ring as a seal, they use wax, and the king's signet ring seals it. It can't be taken back. There's no way to take what the king has said back. Even though you're the king, you can't take it back. So they've got to think what they can do. So Esther and Mordecai talk to the king. And the king says, you all work it out. Here are my scribes. Here are the men that work for me. You write up what you want to do. We're going to save the Jews some way. And so God in his providence again gives another plan, and that is they devise another letter that goes out to all the providences coming up to this date that they're going to be killing all the Jews. But this will take precedent over that. And it said, the letter in essence says, when you receive this letter, understand that the Jews have my permission, King Xerxes says, to protect themselves. They can defend themselves. If you want to try to attack them, they're going to defend themselves, and there'll be no punitiveness against the Jews for that. They have every right to protect themselves. So most of the Persians and the empire, the 227 provinces, don't really want to cause a lot of problems. So they get this same letter saying, don't do any. I mean, it's been said that they will be killed on a certain date, but the precedent is the Jews can protect themselves, so the Persians decide it's not worth it to us. And there are some battles. The Bible does tell us in the following chapters that there are some battles between the Jews and the Persians, but the Jews prevail and all is saved. So in chapter 8, verse 11, by these letters the king permitted the Jews in every city to gather together and protect their lives. This is chapter 8, verse 11. To destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that should assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. God could have wiped out the enemy. He could have saved them, his people, many times over. But as it often does today, he worked in a natural unfolding of events. That's a very important statement, folks. God works in an unfolding of natural events to make things happen. What's going on in the world, God's in control. It may appear that you think that the devil's got control, and he does have a foothold here, and he's causing terribleness down here on earth. But God's still in control. And God unfolds his plans in a natural event. He can cause things to happen in a second, but he does it in a way that is just beautiful, unfolding of events, and gives them the opportunity to be part of the solution. He acted on their behalf, but required that they themselves take a part in this action. Chapter 9, verse 5. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those that hated them. What would have been a complete annihilation of the Jews turned into victory and deliverance. But notice it took action and faith on the people. It took faith that God would be with them, even if his name had never been mentioned. Remember, they were still living in a foreign land, though they had been set free and could return to Jerusalem. They took a breath of oxygen and stood for what was right. God honored their efforts. Verse 22 of chapter 9. The days of which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy, and from mourning to a holiday. They should make them days of feasting and joy. And every year to this day, the Jews still have the day of Purim, Purim, which is the day of a feast. It's a festival. They go to their synagogues. They'll either read them in their home, but they read the book of Esther, complete book of Esther. And every time the name Haman comes up, there's boo, boo, boo. They're yelling and screaming. They won't let the rabbi, even today, they won't let him. They do it once a year. In fact, in 2020, it's going to be on March the 20th and 21st, I think it is, that they will have the day of Purim. This is not a feast that was instituted by God. This is, I think God instituted it, but it's not written in the Bible that one of those that the main feasts of the Jews, but it is a feast that they have today. And they have a little rattle. And I've seen them on television. The Jews have this rattle, and it's kind of like a Halloween thing. Clang, 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 clang. The minute that the name Haman comes, clang, 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 clang. And what do they do at this Feast of Purim? They do three things. They pray, thanking God that they are worthy, thanking God that they were worthy when God saved them, and that they're still worthy and God has not given up on them. God's not happy with them, but God has not given up on them. They pray that God would preserve they pray and thank God for preserving their ancestors. And the last thing they pray for three things during this time of feast. That God has allowed them the last 12 months of life. In other words, every 12 months they come in, and the third thing they say is, thank you, God, for letting me be alive another year. You let me be alive another year. So, chapter 10 ends with a beautiful saying. The last verses of chapter 10 are seeking. This is about Mordecai. Mordecai was made second in command to king. He is now the prime minister. Mordecai is of the great country of mighty. I don't mean a great country, but a mighty country of the country of Persia, and he is now over everything except what the king wants to be over. So, and it ends with Mordecai was seeking the good of his people and speaking to all of his countrymen. That's the story of Esther. I hope you will read it. I hope you will enjoy it, understand it. God is at work. God continues to be at work. He's working very, very hard. He never sleeps, never rests. It's always God's plan that we would seek him and be a part of his kingdom. Thank you for tuning in today. Thank you again.